This subject of confined space air monitoring can be the difference between life and death. Fully two-thirds of the people who die in confined space accidents die because of a hazardous atmosphere. And so this is an important subject. And so knowing what you're dealing with when you're in that confined space is essential. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Confined spaces can be deadly. Unfortunately, we have had fatalities in confined spaces over the history of the trust, and that hurts my heart a lot. Not just for the individuals there, but it's something where we can prevent these. These are fatalities that can be prevented if we do our part and if we know what we're dealing with. So let's dive into this. What is a confined space? We're going to hit this really quickly. Here's some examples, and here's the OSHA definition of what a confined space is. It's big enough to get into. It is hard to get into. It's not just opening a door and walking in. I've got to go through a manhole, use a ladder or something like that. It's not a normal room that I'm walking into, and it's not designed for continuous human occupancy or employee occupancy. It doesn't have ventilation, doesn't have the things that it needs to support life if something goes wrong. All right. And once we have a confined space, it has the potential to be a permit required confined space. Now, that's the OSHA standard. That means there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. Today, we're not focusing about everything else. We're only focusing on the gas detection part of that. But if I put a hazard in a confined space, then it becomes a permit required confined space. Here's a list of the various hazards that we might find in there. And the last one on the list is the important one that contains or has a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Well, potential really opens up the opportunity a lot for many of our confined spaces to be permit required, because a confined space simply sitting there without good ventilation has the potential to have a low oxygen environment, has the potential to kill us. So once we have a confined space, and particularly a permit required confined space, we've got to be worried about what's in there. Chemicals can be deadly. And when I put those in a confined space, the chance that that chemical concentrates to a point where it can be more dangerous to us really goes up, because it's a confined space. And by definition, it doesn't have great ventilation. Okay, so chemicals get into our bodies through various different routes, and we're really focused on one of those in this session, and that's inhalation. When we breathe a chemical in, it hits our lungs, hits our bloodstream, and it can get anywhere in our body and do damage to us. And so inhalation is the primary route. And once again, two-thirds of the fatalities that happen in confined spaces are due to hazardous atmospheres. Well, how much of a chemical is too much? That is a great question, and we have some help with that. We have what are called exposure limits, and those exposure limits can either be a legal limit or a recommended health-based limit. And we'll talk about two of those here. One of those is the permissible exposure limit. This is OSHA's number. They also call it the PEL for short. And it is a legal limit. Your employer can expose you to whatever the chemical is up to its PEL 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for your working lifetime, and not get a citation, not get a fine from OSHA for overexposing you. Does that mean it's a healthy limit? Well, in some cases, yes. But in other cases, it's not a great limit because it's kind of political, right? It's a legal limit that's been imposed. A better number in almost all situations is the threshold limit value, or TLV. This is something that is developed by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. Boy, that's an exciting group. You'd want to go to their convention. This is a group that takes the best data, the information on toxicology, information on actual accidents that have happened, exposures, all of those things. They put all of that together and they come up with a safe limit, the threshold limit value that you can work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for a working lifetime, because we're talking about occupational exposure without concern for deleterious effects to our health, right? I can work at the TLV for my whole working career at that level and not have to be feared that my health will be damaged because of that chemical. So those are important things. There are certain chemicals that have ceiling limits as well. Now, these other limits for PEL and the TLV are what we call threshold limit values. Through the day, your exposure to chemicals goes up and down. I may work at zero exposure for half the day, and then all of a sudden I go up to a high level for 2 or 3 hours, and then I go down. It's the average of that exposure over my workday is what we're measuring, except there are some of these chemicals that have ceiling limits. And a good example for many of you out there is chlorine gas. You may use that in your water systems or in your sewage treatment systems for residual chlorine. If you are exposed to chlorine, you have a 1 part per million ceiling limit. That means that from a regulatory standpoint, I can't go above that, or I'm overexposed if I don't have respiratory protection on. So those are important things to know, because we're talking about gas detection today. You got to know what those numbers mean when you read those off of your meter. All right, so let's talk about these airborne hazards. A hazardous atmosphere, gases really aren't bound by a lot. They can just float around us. You move your hands around. Hey, I can feel there's some air there, but I can't see it. I can't smell it, except maybe in the room where this guy is. I really don't even know it's there, except I know in the back of my mind that there's air and I'm breathing in and out. And if I don't have it, I'm in trouble. So we have a responsibility to be able to know what we're working with, to be able to characterize what the risk is to each of us. And sometimes those bad gases can come from decomposition products. If you are working in a sewer system, well, there's going to be some stuff coming out of our waste products that are going down the sewer line that could be bad for you. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy. We take a chemical into a confined space, or we start up a gas-fired piece of equipment, a saw or a generator, a compactor inside of a confined space, and we gas ourselves with carbon monoxide. So we've got to be aware of where these might come from. Sometimes they're natural, sometimes it's up to us or somebody else. Well, there are some common gases that we're always going to deal with, and they're the basics that we need to know really, really well. Here they are: oxygen, flammable atmospheres, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. These are the 4 gases that if you have a 4-gas meter, confined space meter, this is what we're going to read. And we're going to go through each one of those and also other gases right now. Oxygen is critical to life. I've got to have it. If I go beyond 3 or 5 minutes without oxygen, I'm not gonna be around for very long. So I gotta have oxygen, and I've got to have enough oxygen. And you say, well, how much is enough oxygen? Well, normal air that I'm standing in is 20.9% oxygen. And in general, that doesn't fluctuate very much at all unless something is consuming that oxygen. How much is not enough oxygen? Well, that's anything below 19.5%. How much is too much? That's anything over 23.5%. So I've got a 4% window of where I'm safe. And you say, well, why can I have too much oxygen? Because, when grandma got sick, I remember they put an oxygen mask on her, a nasal cannula, and she breathed high concentration oxygen. And that's absolutely correct. We can breathe higher concentrations of oxygen. The problem comes from safety when I'm working in an oxygen enriched atmosphere. If I get too much there and I get a spark, things burn that don't normally burn, or they burn really hot. And so we want to keep that oxygen below 23.5 and above 19 and a half. Those are important numbers. And all these numbers that we talk about in here, if you're a confined space entrant, you need to know these numbers because they have a real bearing on whether you live or die. All right, let's keep going here. Always measure oxygen first. It is essential to our life. It's also essential for some of the other sensors to ensure that they're working adequately. Why do we do that? Because bad things can happen. We can have fires and explosions, and that's the next number that we're going to look at. And we're going to read the percent of the lower explosive limit, or LEL. And you say, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, when I have, what does it take to have a fire? It takes three things plus a chemical reaction. It takes heat, fuel, and oxygen. Now, I know I just told you, we've got 20.9% oxygen all around us. If I spill something that is a fuel, all I need is a spark or heat, an ignition source to make that go if there's enough fuel in the air. Well, I can measure how much fuel is in the air with my confined space meter. And it's going to read out in percent of the lower explosive limit. And that means how close 100% of the LEL means all I got to have is a spark, and we're going to have a boom or a flame. And so I need to be able to measure that, how close I am. On your meter, you don't want to get above 10% of the lower explosive limit. What if I do? You better be evacuating right now. Your meter, your alarm's going to go off at 10% of your lower explosive limit or above. Okay, that means there's sufficient flammable vapors to support combustion in the air at 100% LEL. But we don't want to get close to 100% because things change fast, and burning to death is a really bad way to go. This is this is why we test. This is why we ventilate these spaces, is so we don't have these kind of things happening. Carbon monoxide is a product of incomplete combustion. So if I start that motor, it's not going to burn 100% cleanly, and it's going to put out carbon monoxide. When I breathe that in, it comes in contact with my blood, and it bonds with the hemoglobin in my blood. Hemoglobin is what transports oxygen to our tissues and to our brain. If I can't get oxygen to that hemoglobin, I'm just going to die of lack of oxygen. So we talk about carbon monoxide poisoning. What it really is, the poisoning just prevents us from getting oxygen to our tissues, and it binds on really strongly, and it's hard to get out. So we've got to look at what we're dealing with, but more importantly, we need to be watching and reading what that is. So what's the number on that? 25 parts per million is the threshold limit value. And we need to keep our exposure in the confined space below that 25 parts per million number. Hydrogen sulfide is also another really common nasty gas that we find in industry. Petroleum refineries will have this, but in local government agencies, sewer systems are probably the most common source of hydrogen sulfide. You guys probably have all smelled this. At low concentrations, hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten egg gas. It's stinky stuff, and you go, whew, wow. That's not very nice. But at higher concentration, hydrogen sulfide turns off our smeller. They call it olfactory fatigue. It turns our sense of smell off, and we don't know it's there. If I get up high enough, this stuff will simply cause my heart and lungs to stop working, and I die. This is really dangerous stuff. And the number on this one, we have two numbers. One is it's a ceiling limit, right? I can't go above 20 parts per million on hydrogen sulfide. But the number I'm going to read on my confined space meter, it needs to be less than 10 parts per million. Now, memorize these numbers because they are really critical. What about other toxics? There are other gases out there that can be nasty as well. We talked about chlorine gas. This 4-gas confined space meter will not tell you that chlorine is there. So what do I do? Because in chlorine, it has a 1 part per million ceiling limit. Wow. That's really low. Well, you can go out and purchase another meter, a single gas meter. These are not crazy expensive, relatively cheap, and I can test for that other chemical that is there. Will there be an electrochemical meter like this for everything? Probably not. But for many of the nasties that you're going to be dealing with, you can just simply go out and purchase a direct reading meter for those. All right, so let's review those limits that we talked about, because if you're the attendant or if you're a confined space entrant, you need to know these numbers. Because when you look at your meter, you need to know how close you are to having a problem. So oxygen between 19.5 and 23.5, lower explosive limit below 10% LEL, and carbon monoxide below 25 parts per million, and hydrogen sulfide below 10 parts per million. Burn that into your brain so you know that when you're doing confined space entry. All right, so let's talk about monitoring. That's what we promised, and I'm already halfway through the presentation, and we talked about some of those ground rules for that. We have to know what we're doing in monitoring the air. I can't just grab a meter and say, yeah, we're all good. Throughout my career, I've got a lot of phone calls where people called up and said, hey, can you come test the air? And I said, sure, absolutely, I'd be happy to. What would you like me to test for? And they're like, well, test whether it's good or not. Well, that's where the challenge comes in air monitoring. We've got to know enough about the process to know what we're getting into. Now we can shotgun approach it with the 4-gas meter and get the basics down. The common toxics, have enough oxygen, and we're not going to burn to death. Those are important. But beyond that, we may have to look a little bit deeper and ask some questions of others. When I first went to college and started studying industrial hygiene, I had this vision in my head of Mr. Spock from Star Trek and his tricorder. He had this meter that would tell you everything. It would tell you if there were life forms hiding behind the bushes about ready to take out the guy in the red uniform, or if there were gases that were there that could be toxic. I had this vision of that's going to be my job. I'm going to go out there with a tricorder and I'm going to be able to tell you everything about your environment. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist. There is no machine out there that will tell you everything and ensure that everything is safe. So we've got to have some training. We've got to be smarter, and sometimes we've got to bring in some experts to help us with that. When we talk about different sampling equipment, I can go out with a pump, filters, sorbent tubes, various different types of sampling equipment, and collect even bags. They have Tedlar bags where I can collect a volume of air and send it off to a lab. And then the lab does analysis on it, and a couple of weeks later, I get my results back. Well, that doesn't help us a whole lot in a confined space. It may be a part of our overall sampling regimen, but it's probably not going to be what we'll use in a confined space. There are detector tubes. These are little glass tubes that have reagent in it. I break off both ends, and then I take a pump and I draw air through it, and the material in there will change color, and I can read how many parts per million of the chemical that I'm worried about are in that little snapshot of air that I took. Those are handy, but they're not continuous. All I'm getting is a snapshot, and I've got to have different test detector tubes for every chemical that's out there. So there are pluses and minuses to all of these things. The best thing that we could have would be a direct reading meter, an electrochemical meter that will come in contact with that gas on a sensor and send a signal to the display that says this is how much gas we're seeing in the air of that particular chemical. That's awesome. When I first started in this field, these things were tens of thousands of dollars, and the batteries didn't last very long. Now the batteries last more than your shift, and they're relatively cheap. The sensors last a long time. There's no reason to not have one of these if we're doing confined space entry. You need to have meters, and they need to be calibrated. They need to be bump tested. You say, what does it mean to bump test? Every time before you use your meter, it needs to be bump tested. We're going to compare it against a known standard, a cylinder calibration gas. Some of you folks um, have a bump station where I take my meter and I snap it in there and I push a button and it does a bump test, and it will beep and say bump test passed. That's awesome. Love it if you've got that. If you don't, we simply take this meter and we connect it to a cylinder of calibration gas, and I read what it says on the meter. And does it read exactly what it says on the cylinder calibration gas? If it does, you pass your bump test and you go out and use the meter with confidence. If it doesn't read exactly right, I need to calibrate the meter. And what do I do with that? Well, I'm going to teach the meter what it's seeing. I have a known concentration of gas in this cylinder, and I can teach the meter what zero is and what the number that's supposed to see here, and then I get a slope, and it tells me exactly what my exposure is. In your organizations, most of you will have one person or a couple of people that are the meter gurus. They calibrate your meters and ensure that they're always working right. Um, and that begs the question, can you calibrate your own meters? And the answer is yes. I know there are a lot of companies out there that would like to charge you to calibrate your meters for them. And that's a fine service. I'm not talking that down, but you need to be able to calibrate your own meters, because you never know when you're going to fail a bump test and need to calibrate that meter before you go out there. So designate the person who's the meter guru and get them the training. It's not hard, but get them the training to be able to do that calibration. You can take the owner's manual and figure it out as well. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Um, we want to make sure we're testing your space the right way. We want to understand what it is you're exposed to and what it is where you're going to be working. And so the appropriate meter is important. The way we gather the sample is important as well. So if I've got this meter and I'm standing up at the top of a big water tank and I need to test the air in there, how am I going to determine what the air is where I'm going to be working when I crawl down that ladder to the bottom of this 30-foot deep water tank? Well, I've got to test the air there. I use things like pumps. Here's a pump, and I may have a long hose that I drop all the way to the bottom of that water tank to test the air there. And then I'm going to test it other places as well. I need to test at least top, middle, and bottom of that space. But if it's a big, deep space like that 30-foot deep tank, I'm going to test multiple layers in there beyond top, middle, and bottom just to ensure that it's right. When I use a pump, it takes time for the air that I'm sucking in at the bottom of that 30-foot deep tank to go all the way through the hose, through the pump, and expose the sensors in this meter, and then get the meter to respond with a number. So I've got to know that each of the pumps will have something written on the pumps or in the documentation that says how many feet per minute or second that it will take. It may also tell you volume of air that it pumps, so you can get an idea of how long do I need to wait before I do that. But remember, test where you're going to be breathing. That's the air you're going to be breathing, and don't just rely on one test. Don't take this meter and tie a rope on it and drop it down in there if you've got a pump there. Now, I'm telling you, it's not a great idea to tie a rope on it and drop it down in there, but that's better than nothing. If you don't have a pump, do that. But the problem is I can't tell what the meter says. If the alarm goes off, I can tell that, but I really don't know what the real problem is unless I can read it. Okay. Let's see. There are various different things, different bells and whistles that we can get on our meters. New meters, like I said, are much better these days. They will last a lot longer, they're cheaper, all of those things. Some have Bluetooth capabilities. So the attendant of the confined space can not only have his or her meter that they're monitoring, but the entrance can have their meters clipped to their shoulder in the breathing zone. And that meter will talk not only with the attendant and tell the attendant what this meter is reading, but also with the other meters. If I had multiple people in there with meters, the meters talk with each other and will give a supervisory alert or an alarm. If one of them sees the chemical or goes into an alarm, it will tell all the other meters it's time to get out. So look at those things. Some are data logging where you'll get information, you'll be able to track your exposure through time. You'll have to download that over time. All of that's really good stuff, but a basic confined space meter is really all you need, along with the calibration equipment and a pump to be able to determine where you're at. Okay. There's some challenges that go along with using this equipment. Sometimes we have some cross reactivities or interferences that will cause problems with our electrochemical sensors. These sensors will pick up the chemicals we're talking about, but they also may have a cross reactivity with something else. Hydrogen is a real known problem for that. So if you're working in an area where you are charging batteries, lead acid batteries in particular, that can release hydrogen gas. And if you ever see numbers jumping around rapidly on any one of these meters, that means there's probably a problem with a cross reactivity. Generally, these are pretty slow and methodical changing from one number to another. But if you're at 2 parts per million and then it goes to 200 and then it goes down to 12 and then it goes to 73, you probably got a cross reactivity issue. And if you run into that, call me and we'll work you through that and figure out what's going on, because we want to ensure that your meter's always being accurate and you're not getting something that will throw a monkey wrench in the works there. All right, let's go to the last slide here. Document. We always want to write down what we see. Even if I have a data logging meter, your permit required confined space entry permit has a space on there for air sampling results. And you should write those down at least every 15 minutes, but we're going to do continuous monitoring. I'm not turning this thing off when people are in that confined space. It needs to be continuously monitored, but we want to write that down and preserve that on the permit. We may download the information so we can see, oh, we had a spike at this time, and so we can track if we have some issues. That's also another way to do it. But document those things. Keep your canceled permits when you're done, so you can prove to OSHA that you're doing it right. But more importantly, so we can go back and look at our entries and see if there are any issues or ways that we can get better. All right, just remember, do it right every time. Bump test it. Calibrate it if it won't pass bump test. Test it every time. Test and ventilate the spaces, and 2/3 of our confined space fatalities go away. Let's do it right every time and go home safe every day. Thanks, folks, for all of that. If you've got questions or comments, I would love to answer those right now. Type them into the chat box, and Mike will read those to me. We got anything to this point, Mike?
Nope, I don't have anything in the chat box, folks. Go ahead and open up that chat box. If you have any questions, let's ask them right now. These confined spaces, man, they're deadly. And we have to, if you've got questions, please ask. That's what we're here for. Jason and I are here. If you have questions on any of this kind of stuff, we want everyone to be able to go home safely at night. If you've got the question, please ask. Give Jason or I a call. Type it here in the chat right now. We are more than happy to help and answer anything you guys have.
Thanks, Mike. A good point. This is a no judgment zone when it comes to safety, right? If you don't know what you're doing on this, or you've never done this, give us a call. No judgment. We will help you get this in place and done right. And we'll even, if there's a challenge with funding with your organization, we will have that conversation to ensure that you have the tools to keep you safe in doing these hazardous tasks. So, anything come in?
Nope, nothing in there. Go ahead. What's the final word?
All right. Do it right every time. Go home safe every day.